Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. I've been playing around a bunch more with the Canon R5, and so today I want to take you through how I've got the camera set up, both on the outside, buttons, dials, all that kind of stuff, and then the menu itself. So going through the menus and going through what I've chose to turn on, turn off, and all that kind of stuff. Again, this is from my perspective as a bird photographer, birds in flight being my kind of what I do the most. So, take what you can from it and apply it, I guess, if you find it useful. But, a lot of people do a lot of different kinds of photography, so what I present today may not apply directly to the type of photography you do. So, anyway, before I go into the details of the camera setup and the menus, I just want to say that I've been shooting this camera now for ever since it was available, not that long, but it hasn't taken me long to really fall in love with this camera. It's really the most flexible camera that I've ever used, and for the type of hybrid shooter I am, stills mostly and then just small bits of short video clips, say 1-2 minutes in 4K 60 or something like that, it's working out really, really well. I'm sure most of you have heard about the overheating issues that have been on social media and stuff like that, and I can say that here in the Florida sun, I've been out in 90-degree plus weather for hours, and I've had no overheating issues with this camera. Again, I'm not shooting a ton of video. It's mostly stills, but I'm shooting long bursts of birds in flight and things like that, and I'm not having any overheating issues. So I wouldn't let anybody convince you that this camera isn't worth going after, especially if you're an action photographer and mostly doing stills, right? And then a little bit of video. It's really just an amazing camera so far. Now, I've also heard some stuff from people that are saying that electronic viewfinder and lag and all that kind of stuff, you can't track birds in flight for long bursts with this camera, or maybe even any other mirrorless camera at this point. Well, I wouldn't let anybody convince you of that either, at least not until you try it yourself. I do mostly birds in flight, and I track birds over relatively long distances, shooting long bursts. And with this camera, I have no problems tracking birds, both with the electronic shutter and with the mechanical shutter. Now, I will say this, I'm using mostly my 600 f4, and my 600 f4 with a 1.4 times and also a 2 times at up to 1200 millimeters, right? The lag in the viewfinder is minimal. The frames per second is about maximum, I would say, for both the electronic and the mechanical shutter, 20 and 12 respectively, I would say. So it's doing great with my primary birding lens, right? I've also tried a 400 5.6 and my 300 f4, some older lenses. They do slow things down a bit, right? The communications just don't seem to be quite as fast, obviously, between the camera and the lens, and so things slow down a bit. And when you get into the mechanical shutter and using those lenses, the lag gets a little bit to be a little bit of an issue. Okay, I can still track birds, and I still get some fairly long bursts of flight shots with those lenses. So it's not a no-go with those older lenses, but it does bring in a little bit more lag. I've now just tried the 100 to 400 too, and I even got my hands on an 800 millimeter f11. And those lenses on this camera are right up there speed-wise with my 600 f4. The lag and all that kind of stuff being pretty much non-existent, and the speed's right up there with the maximum that this camera can provide. So again, I think overall, so far, this camera is really doing everything I could have asked it to do. So with that said, give it a try yourself. It's only really the way to judge a camera or a lens or anything else that you're doing, is to get it yourself and give it a try to see if it fits your style. So without further ado, I'm going to start going over a little bit here about how I have this camera set up. I think I've got my settings pretty much where I want them. There'll be some changes, I'm sure, over time, but for now I think I've got things the way I want them for a while. So we'll start with the camera itself. You know, birds in flight and wildlife in general, you know, sometimes things can be planned a little bit. You can see things starting to happen, but a lot of times things happen very, very rapidly. So I like to set my camera up in both the outside, you know, buttons and dials and stuff like that, and on the menus to, you know, really bring speed, you know, being able to do things quickly into play. Okay, that's what's really important for me. So autofocus, right? So let's start there. I'm a back button autofocus shooter, not a half press. So the way I have my camera set up right now, the R5, is autofocus on is the primary engagement of autofocus, and it's set up to use whatever autofocus method, be it zone or point or whatever I choose to be my main autofocus area. And I have the toggle for that to be the action ring here on the adapter, since I'm adapting mostly EF lenses at this point. So I have the adapter with the ring on it, and this is how I scroll through and pick my different autofocus methods or areas or whatever you want to call them, and then it's engaged when I'm shooting with the autofocus on button. I have the asterisk button or the AE lock button on my camera set to another autofocus mode, and that's the eye detect and tracking. Okay, so quickly I can go from zone to eye tracking just by pushing a different button, right, with my thumb. And so can't get much quicker than that, and I like that. I've also set up a third autofocus area or zone, and that's the spot autofocus, in case you have a bird in a tree or a bush or something and you have to get really pinpoint to get accurate focus on its head. And what I've done is I've taken the depth of field preview button and set that up as going to point, and then I'll hold that and I'll hit the autofocus on button, and I can get a pinpoint autofocus that way. And usually those types of scenarios aren't where you have to be really, really quick about it. It's a little bit harder to hit that button and then the autofocus on button to get that pinpoint autofocus, autofocus. But most of the time when you have a bird in a situation like that, you have time to do something like that. When the birds in flight are happening quickly, you know, these are instantaneous pretty much. So that's how I have that set up. As far as dials go, I've got the dial right behind the shutter button. This is my aperture. I've got the dial associated with the mode dial. That's my change of shutter speed. And then I have the dial in the back, the thumb wheel. I have that set up for my ISO. So again, everything's right there. I can change everything on the fly. I shoot almost exclusively manual exposure. I don't do any kind of auto anything, not even auto ISO. So I'm changing things pretty rapidly sometimes, especially if it's partly cloudy out and lights changing up and down a lot. So I'll go here, here, and here, and that's pretty much it, right? So you got things going pretty quickly there. As far as the joystick up here, I have it set to where basically it's instantaneous as far as moving around the autofocus point, and that's something that you can choose in the menu. You can have it set to where you have to press the button here, which is your autofocus point select activation button, I call it. Kind of a long term there, I guess, but that's really what it is. And then in order to move your autofocus point, you have to hit that and then move the joystick. In the menu system, which I'll get to in a little while, you can actually change that setting to where this is on all the time. So I don't have to hit that button to move my autofocus around. I just hit the joystick, and if I'm on, let's say, center autofocus point or something like that, I can move that around, or even zone. I can move the zone brackets around just by moving the joystick. And I like that a lot better. Again, I'm trying to do speed here, be as quick as I can, and I don't want to have to do too many button press to get to what I want. So that's how I have that set up, and you know, for the most part, that's the main setups on this camera, right? I mean, we can go into the quick menu and all that kind of stuff, but for the most part, that's how I have my dials and main buttons that I use when I'm shooting birds in flight and birds in general set up on the outside of the camera. So the next thing I want to do is start going over the menus and some of the menu choices that I've made. And again, this is for birds, right? This is for birds and birds in flight. I'm not going to be going over video settings in the menus or anything like that, and some of the menu items we'll skip over pretty quickly because they really don't have any application to what I do for the most part, and other things we're going to dive into a little bit more deeply, well, as deeply as you can dive into a menu anyway in a camera. But some of these menus these days can get pretty deep. This one's pretty simple though. It's set up really nicely, so it flows nicely, and it's pretty easy to get through the settings pretty rapidly. So stay tuned here. In a minute we'll start going through the menus. Okay, let's jump into the menus. The first tab, the red menu, symbol of the camera, right? And tab number 1, shooting number 1 menu, the image quality. So Canon has RAW and JPEG. And with the JPEG, we've got a bunch of different sizes, large and medium, all the way down the line to small. And of course that affects file size and also the amount of compression that you're going to have, and then thus data loss from those different compression rates. As a bird photographer and not really worrying about post-processing, because I love the post-process, and in order to get, of course, the most out of your images as far as dynamic range and the flexibility to process them, I shoot RAW. I bet most of you out there shoot RAW. But you have a choice, right? You have RAW or C-RAW. And you can see here, I have set my camera to C-RAW. So let's talk about C-RAW just for a minute. So you have full RAW, right? That's in this camera. When you shoot full RAW images, bird images, you're going to get file sizes that are somewhere in the 50 megabyte range, which is really big. 45 megapixel sensor. C-RAW, I've done a bit of investigation here, and I've looked at file sizes, and I've come to an average reduction in file size of about 40%, right? So you're dropping the file size by 40%, which means that the camera's processor has to move a lot less data, a lot less information has to be moved around in the camera, which is going to speed things up, right? When you take those images, those files to your computer, things are going to go faster as well because again, file sizes are smaller. So C-RAW, right? You're talking about buffer size in this camera. When you shoot RAW, you have a buffer about 50 images, and of course the buffer's got to dump to your card, Compact Flash Express, for your fastest write speeds, to dump your buffer as fast as possible. But you're going to hit a buffer wall really quickly when you shoot RAW. 50 megapixel, 50 megabytes per image, right? C-RAW, now you're down to about 24, 25. So that extends your buffer from 50 to 99, 100 plus. So what I have found by going with C-RAW, you can now basically shoot mechanical shutter at 12 frames per second. You can almost shoot it continuously without hitting the buffer wall, right? You will hit one eventually, but it's a lot of images that you can take in a burst and not hit the buffer wall. If you're going to shoot electronic shutter at 20 frames per second or there's about, you're going to hit the wall a little bit quicker, but still not nearly as quick as if you're shooting full-sized RAW images. So for me, C-RAW makes sense, but now you're going to say there's got to be some kind of compromise there, right? The files can't be as nice, the dynamic range has to be less, the detail has to be less. Well, I'll tell you what, if it is, I can't see it. I don't see it when I'm processing my images. I've gone online, I've read some things that people have written about C-RAW, Canon RAW, compressed RAW, whatever you want to call it, and really they can't find any differences either. There may be 1% of the people out there, and they're doing some kind of tests on a bench or something like that, looking at numbers, and they may see a difference, but I'll tell you what, more than likely, in your shooting, when you come home and you're looking at your images or get back to your office or whatever you're doing, when you're doing your post-processing, you're not going to notice a difference. So I'm shooting C-RAW. That's me. I like the extended buffer. I like to shoot longer bursts. I don't want to hit the buffer wall when right when the best action's happening and things like that. So it's C-RAW for me. Dual pixel RAW is on this menu as well. This menu tab, it's disabled. I'm not interested in dual pixel RAW, of course, for birds in flight and all that kind of stuff. Cropping aspect ratio set to full. Okay. Moving down to the second tab in the shooting menu, Shoot 2, exposure comp and all this kind of, it's grayed out. I'm shooting manual. I don't use exposure compensation, so it doesn't really affect me at all. ISO speed settings, I leave them basically all of them available, right? I'm not going to restrict them in any way, so I'm not going to go into those. They stay pretty much the same. HDR, I'm not interested in HDR for birds in flight. That's off. Auto lighting optimizer, off. Highlight tone priority, off. Okay, you can see I'm turning off all this stuff that all this stuff, if you turn it on, takes processor time in my brain, right, in my mind, and it's going to slow the things down that really mean stuff to me, potentially, which is autofocus, speed and things like that. So I turn a lot of this stuff off. Highlight tone priority, it's going to give you more, options in the highlights of your image, but it's going to potentially bring up noise and stuff in the shadows and things, which I don't want. So I'm keeping that off. External speed light control, not of interest, not of importance here for birds in flight, obviously, or bird photography in general, because I don't use a better beamer or anything like that ever. All natural light for me. Tab 3, Shoot 3, white balance. I don't shoot auto white balance. Okay, I shoot a Kelvin value on this camera I've determined by shooting auto white balance, and then when I came back I was changing the color temperature of my images in Adobe Camera Raw, and I was going to 6100 most of the time, and I liked the way it looked natural to me. So then I changed my white balance to Kelvin 6100. That's my color temperature I like. And so now when I get back and I look at my images, they're set pretty much the way I want them, and I don't have to touch it for the most part. It's also nice if you're going to shoot a series of images and stitch them together. They're all going to look pretty much the same. Auto white balance is going to change things between images, and then you're going to have to try to match them, things like that. So I like shooting a Kelvin value. You can always change it in post if you're shooting raw, but it's just one less thing you have to do if you have it set pretty much the way you like it. Custom white balance, I'm not going to worry about it. White balance shift, I'm not worried about it. Color space, right, the next one down there, Adobe RGB. Might as well shoot, might as well match to what I post-process in on the camera. To me, matching things as much as you can and all these types of things makes sense. Picture style, I got sent to neutral, clarity to 0, lens aberration correction. We can go into that. Here we go. I've got the 16 to 35 on there right now, so the illumination correction, distortion correction are on, digital lens optimizer's on for this lens, right? And it'll tell which lens that you have on the camera, and it can do some different things for you, if depending on what you've got going. So anyway, that's pretty much that menu. We will get out of this, I hope. So yeah, let's hit the menu button and get out of that. Let's go to tab 4. I wish I could just push the touch screen, but I'm doing it on a recorder, on an external recorder recording this, and of course things don't work exactly the way you want them, so it's going to be a little bit more of an adventure here, but stick with me, we'll get through this. Long exposure noise reduction, off, right? No long exposures in birds in flight or birds in general. High ISO speed noise reduction, I've just left it at the standard. I don't see any reason to change that right now. And dust delete data, we don't need to worry about that. Moving on, multiple exposures disabled, HDR disabled, focus bracketing disabled. Again, all this stuff is just turned off for birds, right? Interval timer disabled, blah, 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 blah. Shutter mode, here we go, right? Electronic, mechanical, electronic first curtain. Well, with the electronic, you just get 20 shots per second or whatever maximum you can get, depending on what lens you're shooting and what shutter speed you're shooting, and things like that can affect your overall frames per second. But there's no like 20 and then 15 and 10 and stuff to choose from in this camera. So basically, if you have it set to electronic, you're going to be shooting 20 frames per second or as fast as it can shoot, which is okay for most things, and especially birds in flight. You want to get as many frames in during the great action as you can, except you got to take buffer and stuff into account, and how long a burst you might be able to shooting that fast. I'm not going to really worry about electronic first curtain because I'm not going to choose that too often. Mechanical, right? I can choose mechanical. So this is a setting that might change back and forth, right? Mechanical to electronic, depending on what's going on. By shooting mechanical, like I said earlier, you can extend your bursts, right? You're only shooting 12 frames per second instead of 20. If you're shooting C-RAW, you might be able to shoot a burst that just goes on and on and on and on. And believe me, people say, why do you need that? I've had some action with birds, snail kites for example, coming down, picking up a snail, grabbing a snail, taking it up, hovering in front of me, trying to eat the snail right in front of me, great light, all this kind of stuff, and it's like seconds. This is taking seconds, right? And if you're shooting 20 frames per second and you're hitting a buffer wall after a couple seconds, you might miss some of the best action, right? And then you know, dumping the buffer and all that kind of stuff can take some time. Mechanical might extend things, and really there's no gap in being able to capture the action. So that might be something you want to be flipping back and forth depending on the scenario you're shooting. The 7th tab here, shoot 7. Touch shutter disabled. I'm not sitting there and looking at the LCD and touching things and taking pictures. I'm just not doing that with birds, of course. Image review. Let's take a look at image review. Review duration 8 seconds, right? If it comes up, if I have the viewfinder or if I have the LCD on and I get done shooting a burst and that image will come up, it'll be there for 8 seconds, give me a chance to really look at it, maybe check my exposure, things like that, which isn't nearly as prevalent anymore with the mirrorless, because you're seeing your exposure if you want to through the viewfinder, so you're not really checking your exposure nearly as much with the back LCD screen as you used to with the digital SLR. But anyway, 8 seconds seems to be fine. I don't want, this is critical, I do not want viewfinder review. Okay, I don't want to stop shooting and then have for 8 seconds a picture pop up, my last image pop up, and be in the way when I'm ready to shoot again almost instantly, right? So I disable viewfinder review. Get rid of that. I got rid of that. Disabled. Okay, so moving on. As far as metering, 4 seconds for, you know, you hit half press or whatever, it's going to meter for 4 seconds for you. You can change that if you want. 4 seconds seems to be good for me. Exposure simulation, absolutely enabled. One of the big benefits of mirrorless, right? You can see your exposure through the viewfinder. Why not use that? Well, sometimes if the difference in luminosities between the outside ambient light, right, is really bright, and you've got everything toned down in your exposure through your viewfinder for a bright white bird or something like that, and you go from looking at the bright light, ambient light, and you put your eye up to the viewfinder, it may be kind of a shock to your eye, and you can't see what you want to see. So in those types of situations, you might want to turn that off, right? You might want to turn exposure simulation off so that it basically shows you through the viewfinder the ambient light conditions, right? So that can be important at times, but for the most part, I keep it enabled, right? Shooting info display, lots of different things you can choose from here. Deeper in this menu, screen info settings, you can go in there and you can pick from a whole bunch of these different things. This is all personal preference. It's not really big as far as, you know, critical for any kind of, you better do this for birds in flight or you're going to miss a shot or something like that. So I'm not going to go deep into these things. You know, this is really just all personal preference. So moving on to the last tab in Shoot 8, right? The shooting overall menu, the Shoot 8 tab, viewfinder display format. Again, it's kind of personal preference. You can go this way, or you can go this way. Whatever, you know, I don't really care. Now, display performance, power saving versus smooth. Okay, I have it on smooth. Quick moving subjects are displayed smoothly. Yeah, some birds are pretty quick, so I think that's a good choice. So that's the way I've set it up. All right, so now moving on to the next major tab, which is autofocus. Super important stuff in here, right? For birds in flight, birds in general. Autofocus operation. Servo autofocus is what I have it set to. Of course, you know, with back button, that's one reason why you go to back button autofocus a lot of times rather than half press, is because you can basically keep it on servo, which is where I keep it all the time, and you have basically servo. If you hold the button down, your autofocus on button down, or you can let go once you have, let's say you have a perch bird, you let it go, you can basically be in one shot type of autofocus operation. It's not going to autofocus when you go past half press and take your pictures. You can recompose and things like that, and there's no issues. So there's really no reason to be bouncing back and forth as far as the way I shoot, so it stays on servo autofocus, right? Autofocus method, well, yep, there's a bunch. You can go all the way across these from the left to right. This is tracking, right? And if you have animal and stuff on in there, which we'll get to in a little while, and eye detect and all that, that's what we're looking at here, right? Face and then eye and animal versus people and all that kind of stuff. That's the little face there plus tracking. You've got spot autofocus. You've got 1-point autofocus. I've got this grade, the next 2 grade out, which are the center basically, or 1 autofocus point plus surround points, and then 1 autofocus point plus more surround points. And then you go to zone, and then you can go to a vertical zone, and so a larger zone, and those are the ones that I have selected. So you can turn some of these off, and I'm sure a lot of you have done that, because you don't want to have to scroll through them all, right, if you want to change things really quickly. Or you can set up the buttons like I did, and you can just go to them directly, the ones you use the most. So anyway, that's you know, what I've got as far as autofocus method and what's selectable and what I've turned off. I've got the subject to detect animals, right? Birds are animals, so that makes sense. You can go in there. Whoops. Oh yeah, here we go. I knew I'd mess up at some point. Here we go. So you can go into animals, and you can just select, or you can go into subject to detect. You can pick animals, you can pick people, or you can have no priority, right? I rarely shoot people. I shoot animals, so I have it set to animals at this point. Eye detect is disabled because the autofocus method right now is set to zone, and it's not, you know, so that kind of disables that. But if you set it to, here we go, if you go up here and you set it to face priority, you can see that eye detection now is enabled. So it just depends on what method you're in to what is actually available in the menus for you to set and what's actually active when you're shooting. Continuous autofocus. This is an interesting one. It says disabled. Continuous autofocus is not servo autofocus. Continuous autofocus is continuous autofocus, and if you enable that, no matter what you're doing, your camera's going to be autofocusing. Wherever you point your lens, it's going to be autofocusing. I don't want it doing that. I want it to focus when I hit the autofocus on button, so I have my continuous autofocus set to disable, right? So there you go. Don't want it focusing all the time. Touch and drag autofocus settings. I am not going to touch and drag my autofocus points around on the LCD screen. It's just, that's just too much for me. So I'm not going to deal with it, and we'll move on from there. Manual focus peaking settings. Again, I rarely manual focus. Sometimes you have to go to that, but rarely now with the autofocus systems, especially on the R5. It's just amazing. So I'm not going to have to tweak things with manual focus, but I do have peaking set for manual focus, and that's one of the great advantages of mirrorless, right? Over a digital SLR, you can get focus peaking. You can get zebras in there for your exposures. When you show your highlight, it will highlight the overexposed areas and things like that. So the focus guide I have turned off. Assist beam, it's on. Don't really know why it's on. I just haven't turned it off. I don't really need an assist beam most of the time, so we'll just leave it on. And if it seems like if it needs it, it'll do it, and maybe it'll help. It's not critical for anything special to birds in flight. Okay, here we go. Autofocus cases, right? Those of you who shot Canon a lot, you're familiar with the cases that are now built into these things, and I'm set to case 2. Continue to track subjects ignoring possible obstacles, right? But if you notice under tracking sensitivity, I've moved tracking sensitivity all the way down to the negative side. And that basically will go to a locked on type scenario. So once you're on the bird and it's locked on and you've got focus and you're holding the autofocus on button down, It's not going to grab the background. It's not going to grab ripply water if you're shooting over water or something like that, if the bird's flying really low over the water. It's going to stay on the bird, stay on the subject it's locked on a lot longer. And for me, that works really, really well. For other people, it may not. I think it really depends on how good the photographer is at keeping on the bird, right? If you keep on the bird once you're locked on fairly well, keeping the tracking sensitivity down toward the negative side is probably the way to go. Accel, decel, I've never really seen that do a whole lot. For me, anyway, I keep it just kind of in the neutral center position. So that's the case that I generally stick with. Moving down to autofocus tab number 4, electronic with manual focus. I've got it to off. We won't go into that. It's not really a big deal. Again, manual focus stuff just doesn't come into play much for me. One-shot autofocus release priority. Okay, so that can be somewhat important if you shoot on one shot for birds. I don't, so really that setting doesn't really come into play. So I'm not going to go into any psychology about why you might want to do one way or the other. Switching tracked subjects. Okay, let's go into that. So you're tracking and you're on eye detect, and basically another bird comes walking up. You're shooting birds on a beach, whatever, with the babies running around. And all of a sudden it switches eyes on you because another bird gets really close, but you don't want it to do that. You want it to stay on the eye that you're on, right? Well, just disabled it. I went all the way down to 0 on that. So basically it shouldn't switch subjects. Once I've got it on an eye and it's tracking an eye of a bird, it should basically stay on that eye and not switch if something else comes into play. Another eye comes into the view. Okay, so, that's moving on down to lens drive when autofocus is impossible. I turn that on. I've turned it on for many, many years on all sorts of cameras coming from Canon, because if I miss, or the autofocus misses, I don't want it to stop trying. I want it to keep trying, searching, right, if you want to call it that, and until it gets it. Or I pump the autofocus button. I like it to be on. It just seems to work better in most scenarios for me. Limit your autofocus methods. I mean, you can keep them all on if you want, but I showed you in the other menu there that I had some of them turned off. These are the ones I have on right now. That might change depending on the scenario I get into, but for now, these are the ones I feel like are working for me and that I'm going to use the most. And so that's what I've chosen. Again, personal preference, really, right? As far as autofocus method selection, okay, so I've got it set to the multifunction button, which is the one right behind the shutter button, the little button there. And so basically you can scroll through your methods that we just kind of went through in the menu prior. Now I also have that selection method on the dial, right, on the front there. So that's something that I can do 2 different ways, which works fine. I like to have more options than not, so we'll just go with a variety rather than just being into one way of doing things. Can be a good way to go at times. Okay, so down to orientation linked autofocus points. That's the next one down here. And if we go in there, I have separate autofocus points, point only, rather than the same for both vertical and horizontal. Because when you flip things, things do change. So I don't want them to be the same. I like to have it set as separate, and it seems to work better for scenarios that I've been in the past. So we've gone to autofocus number 5 tab. Initial servo autofocus point for face detection tracking. Okay, this is an interesting one. If we go in there, I have it set to what you see here, autofocus point set for that, all those different zone type methods or whatever you want to call them, versus just the center. Okay, so this setting right here lets you basically wherever your autofocus point was when you get into hitting the eye with tracking, eye detect with tracking, it's going to be in the same location versus just going to the center and being the center point. So at least that's the way it seems to work to me. To tell you the truth, I can't say that I have a total understanding of these two different selections here and what they all control and what they all change. It seems to be somewhat nebulous when you start doing different things, especially assigning buttons to do different things as far as autofocus methods or autofocus area or zone or whatever you want to call it. So anyway, if anybody out there can provide a very, very good, concise explanation of these different choices and what they all control, hey, put them in the comments down below. Or whatever, or do a video and link to it or whatever, something, so that we can get a better understanding. Because I've seen some things that it changes, but I don't know that I understand everything that changes with that change in settings or the choice you make here. So anyway, moving on, focus ring rotation, you can change it. RF lens, manual focus ring sensitivity, you can change it, things like that. So that, again, that's just all personal preference, doesn't really have any real bearing on birds or birds in flight type photography. So moving on to the playback menu, again, most of this kind of stuff I'm not even going to spend any time or much time at all on, because not much of this has to do specifically with birds or bird in flight type photography. So we can just scroll through and you can see what's available in the menu. If you don't have the manual, or if you don't have an RF5 yet, you can see what's in here. I mean, magnification, image jump with the quick select wheel. I have it set to 1. I don't like it jumping 10 images at a time, which would be another selection that you could do here. So anyway, pretty much all your normal kinds of things if you're familiar with Canon cameras that have been in Canon camera menus for quite a while. I will stop here real quickly though and talk about highlight alert, right? I like highlight alert. Blinkies, a lot of people that shoot Canon call them. It will highlight on your playback of your images on your camera by blinking black areas that are close or are overexposed, blown out, if you want to say it that way. And so they're nice to have, right? They're a nice way to get an idea if your exposures are where you want them or not. The autofocus point display is also something that's important to me. I like to see my autofocus points being displayed. I like to know what is being focused on as I'm shooting. And when I'm looking at the images in playback, you will see the autofocus points, so you know where the focus was achieved by the camera, if it was achieved at all, right? Playback, grid off, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, so not too much in that overall menu that we really want to go through, but a few things there. I'm not going to even talk about connectivity here with this camera. If you want to connect all this stuff, that's fine for me. I do what I do, and you'll do what you do. So we'll just move on to the next major menu here, which is the setup menu, the #1 tab, record, function, card selection, and all that kind of stuff, right? So I have it to record video or stills to the same card. Okay, I don't have it going to separate cards. Generally, I'm shooting the Compact Flash Express card, the fastest card. So I'm just going to have the videos go to the same card if I shoot a short clip as I do my images. It just works for me. Personal preference. Record options, right? Record your options. Auto switch card for me. Okay, some people like to record separately. Some like to record the same image to multiple cards, the 2 cards that are in the camera, stuff like that. I want to switch cards. I want capacity. I'm shooting long bursts a lot of times. I fill up cards sometimes rather quickly if the action is good, and I don't want to have to change cards. I've never had a card fail, ever. Maybe I'm lucky, but I've never had a card fail. So I Don't feel like I need redundancy. I'm not a wedding photographer, things like that. Wedding photography, redundancy, really important. Bird photography, I've never had a card fail. I want to be able to shoot. I don't want to fill a card and then, fill both cards. And especially when you have cards of different speeds and things, I don't know. I just don't like that. Auto switch card for me, right? That's really about it in that menu that I want to go over. File numbering and all that kind of stuff, whatever. Whatever you guys want to do with your numbering, have at it. Language, English, beep. No beeping. No beeping for me. That's off. Touch is off. All that kind of stuff. Screen, viewfinder, display. This is all, again, kind of personal preference. Auto switching, screen only, viewfinder, screen, whatever. Pick what you want. I'm not going to spend any time on this. Viewfinder brightness. Now, this can be somewhat important. If you really want to emulate your exposure and get a feel for what the exposure really, you kind of have to calibrate your viewfinder brightness. And that's just trial and error for me anyway. But I found a setting of 4. Pretty much when I'm looking through that viewfinder and I think things are set right, whether I bring up a histogram or whatever to look at, or if I look at my meter, whatever, if it looks good to me and I shoot, I come back, I bring those images up on my computer, they look good again, then I think my viewfinder brightness is okay. Everything's looking good. Everything seems to be quote-unquote calibrated. Then that's where I leave it. And for me, viewfinder brightness at 4 seems to be pretty good. Let's move on to tab number 4 under Setup. HDMI resolution, auto, whatever. I'm not worried about it. It's not really applicable to me for most of what I do. Touch control is standard. When you're touching the LCD screen, going through menus and stuff, the sensitivity and all that kind of stuff, that's built into this. Standard seems to be fine. For me, you can disable it if you want. If you don't want any touch controls, I like the touch controls, but standard seems to work fine. Shutter at shutdown, right? Close it. Close it. Protect the sensor. Then you got sensor cleaning and stuff like that. Reset the camera. No, I don't want to do that. Not right now. Spent a lot of time going through this thing, setting it up. Custom shooting modes. I haven't set any custom shooting modes up yet. I will set one for astrophotography, for Milky Way type photography and stuff like that. But I'm not going to do that. I haven't done that yet, so we won't go through any of that. All right. Moving on to the custom function, tab 1 menu. Exposure increments, 1/3, right? ISO steps, 1/3. Rather than a half, right? I like 1/3, more options. Finer resolution on that is good, I think. All the rest of this stuff, bracketing, canceling, and all that kind of stuff really doesn't have anything. I don't really use bracketing. I just change my exposures myself. If I want to go up or down 1/3 of a stop, I just change the shutter speed or something like that. I'm not really into auto bracketing, so I won't go into that. Same exposure for new aperture. Yeah, I guess you can do that if you want. I turned it off. Again, I just turn a lot of this stuff off because I just don't want a lot of stuff going on in the background. If I want it, I'll go in and find it and I'll turn it on if I have a special scenario or situation where I think it's needed. So there's really not a whole bunch of stuff here. You can set your shutter speed range. You can set your aperture ranges. I haven't done any of that yet. I generally don't. I don't really see a need for that unless you're going to shoot aperture priority or shutter priority, which I don't. I shoot manual. There's really no way it's going to pick a shutter speed or an aperture out of the range that I want because I'm making the choices, right? So if you shoot aperture or if you shoot AV or TV, then go ahead and set those ranges if you need to. Dial directions, I've kept them standard, pretty much plus minus the same directions that the default was. Customize buttons, here we go, right? And customize dials. This is really, really good stuff. The flexibility of this camera is really nice. So this is something we're going to dive into here. Okay, customized buttons. Here we go. Well, I already showed you a little bit about how I customize things in the beginning of the video with the outside of the camera, but now you can see how you do it, right? You go into this menu, which is, I love this kind of stuff. It's graphical. I'm a picture kind of guy, you know. I like to learn by looking at stuff. Reading's fine, but pictures are always good, right? So there you go. Shutter button on the top. It says shutter button half press. Metering start. Tells you what it's set to. I don't use half press for my autofocus start, right? Or to autofocus. So I turned that off, and my half press of the shutter button is just metering start, and then the full press, of course, is taking the picture. I'm not going to go over to the other side of this, the video. See the little video camera over there on the right-hand side. Ignore that. It's not there. I'm not going into that. Video button is video button. Okay, video button. Next one down starts the video recording. It's the red button on the top there. Mode is mode, right? Changes your modes. TV, AV, M, P, whatever you want to, you know, all the alphabets in there. You can also use the mode button to switch between video and stills. We're talking about stills, so we're not going to be hitting the mode button and going over to the video side, the dark side. Not right now. Autofocus on, right? The last one down there. Autofocus and metering start, right? And that autofocus on button, like I said, is basically what activates my main autofocus method, which is mostly zone. I love the zone. It's the same as the A9 II functionality of the zone. It picks out the bird 99% of the time. It's amazing, right? Then I said that I had the asterisk button, or the AE lock button, and that is set to eye autofocus and tracking. So I can just move my finger over, my thumb over, hit that button, and I'm on eye tracking, which is really, really awesome. I also said that there's your autofocus point selection button, and it's still set to autofocus point selection. There's your depth of field preview button, and I have it set to AF. Okay, AF switching. So I'll go into that one. Switch to registered autofocus function. And for me, that's point, right? Point autofocus. That's for when the bird's in the bushes and you got to really, you know, thread the needle and get its head. You're not going to do that with zone. You're not going to do that with... You could probably do it with eye detect. You could probably do it that way. But I'm not going to rely on that. I know point's going to work most of the time, so that's the way I've got that set up, right? And here's all of the different things that you can set your buttons to do, right? Lots of different choices. But anyway, we're going to go back. We're just talking about what I've got it set up for right now and why. The lens, any button on the lens, I don't have a lens with a button on it right now, so that's autofocus off, but it's not really set to anything because I don't have one. There you go, the multifunction button, dial functions, scrolling through autofocus methods, things like that. That's what I've got it set up for. Now, you can see the LCD, this camera's got a little LCD panel on the top. The illumination button up there, I have it switched between viewfinder and screen. Because if I have the LCD open, the flippy screen open and stowed in the open, it may come on and I may want to turn it off. Or it may be on viewfinder and I want to review an image or something like that. So I've got a toggle now, and that's what I have my LCD panel illumination button set to do. And so that, you know, I think it works pretty well for that. I haven't had a whole lot of experience with it yet, but it works. For me at this point, the set button is still the set button. Didn't really change that. And the wheels and all that kind of stuff, and the multi-function, you know, movements of the joystick are all basically set to their default positions. So I'm not going to go any further really into the button part of it. We can go to the customized dials now, and you can see, you know, what I've got going on there. I already told you pretty much how I have my dials set up at the very beginning of the video, but you can see now that, you know, we've got the you know, the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO, and then on the ring there, on the adapter, I've got my autofocus area or method selection on that. So that's pretty much the customizations I've done to the buttons and the dials, right? And for me, this is what's so great about the cameras nowadays. If you can't find a way to set up your camera that's really working for you, man, it's going to be tough to find one that you'll be able to do that with. I mean, Sony might have a little more because they've got the custom buttons 1, 2, 3, 4 and all that kind of stuff on their cameras, and Canon doesn't. But I'll tell you what, Canon's come a long way with being able to customize what buttons and dials can do. So I'm really happy with the trend there from Canon. Let's move over to tab 4 in the custom function menu. Add cropping information, no. Turn that off. Audio compression, it's on, but whatever. You know, audio for whatever I'm doing is not going to be, you know, on the camera for the most part. It'll be a separate recorder or something like that if I'm going to do major audio, so I'm not worried about that kind of stuff. I haven't really messed with it. Shutter release, go on down, skip down here. Shutter release without the lens, I turn it off. I don't want it to do that. Retract the lens on power off. Yep, if it can, if it's a lens that can do that and it needs to be retracted, then absolutely have it do that, right? IPTC information, I got that, you know, adding that stuff, I got that turned off. Again, not really applicable to bird photography. Clear all custom functions, nope. Again, that's another one of those things that's a nope. We're not doing that now because it took me several days to get this thing set up the way I like it. And then up here you've got, what's really cool is you have my menus, and you can customize a bunch of my menus. I haven't done that yet. I have done one. And I do this to all my cameras, and one of the custom menus has just one thing on it, and it's format card, right? Easy to get to, quick to find, quick to do. And I love Canon cameras. Formatting their cards is lickety-split. If you've ever shot Sony and you formatted cards, does it take a long time? Well, relative to other things, no. But relative to how long it takes to format a card in Canon, Sony takes like hours. No, it doesn't take hours, but it takes a while, and it's kind of frustrating in a little way. I don't know why, but it does frustrate me a bit. So Canon formatting their cards has always been really fast, but I like to be able to get to it really easily. And so I have one tab in my menu, number 1 being just format card. So basically that's it, right? That's it. You know, there's no card in my camera right now. Imagine that. Well, it's because I'm downloading a bunch of images from this morning. But anyway, that's going through the menu system pretty quickly. But you know, there's not a lot of things that you need to you know, change specifically for birds. It's more getting the camera set up the way you like it, right? The way you can do things quickly. And so to end this video on setup of this camera for bird photography, I'm going to turn the menus off here, and I'll get back to a more personal ending to this video. So stay tuned. All right, well, I'm back after looking at all those menus. So anyway, I want to end this video with just by saying that, you know, a lot of this stuff is personal preference. But to me, again, the thing about shooting birds and birds in flight is that you want to be able to react quickly, change things quickly, shoot quickly, because things do happen a lot of times very, very quickly. So you don't want to be, you know, having to actually scroll through autofocus methods. If something's not working, you can't get a focus on that bird you've been sitting waiting 2 days for, and it finally pops out of the bush right in front of you, and for some reason zone's not working. You don't want to have to be scrolling through things to try to get to spot autofocus, right? Just move your thumb over and hit spot autofocus, and away you go. So that's really, you know, kind of the crux of the whole thing for me is speed, and of course that just takes getting things set up the way you like them, so that you can be as fast as you can be and as efficient as you can be when you're out doing your bird photography. So I don't know that there's a whole lot more that I can add to what's been going on here with the R5 for me for the past several days, other than the fact is that I really think this camera is really the best all-around camera that I've used in my time as a wildlife photographer, which now is going on 30 plus years. So, you know, that I guess says something. It says something about technology. Maybe things are getting too good. I'm a little worried about that, right? You know, pretty soon it's not going to take any talent at all, any skill at all, to get really good images of some things that used to be really hard to do. I mean, birds in flight used to be pretty darn challenging. Now with these autofocus systems, things are getting easier, no doubt, easier. And so anyway, I will end here, and thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.